Shalom, and welcome to a new lesson in the series of the people of Israel are coming home. Today, in the book of Joshua, we are studying chapter 19, Perek Yud Tet. Chapter 19 deals with 6 tribes who are receiving their part in the land of Israel. After we concluded the 2.5 tribes that received on the eastern side of the Jordan River, they received their part from Moses. We then studied about the 2.5 tribes who received their part from Joshua. That's Judah, Ephraim, and half of Manasseh. And then, chapter 18, we discussed the beginning of the last 7 tribes who were receiving their part. We started with Benjamin, and in this chapter, chapter 19, Perek Yud Tet, we are speaking about Shimon, Zvulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. We're not going to be able to go into depth in every single one of these tribes in our 15 minutes of this lesson, but I want to talk maybe about 2 of the tribes a little more in depth and seek a specific phenomena which appears here. The first tribe in chapter 19 is Shimon. And it's interesting that Shimon, we see in verse 1, it says, Vayetze hagural hashini leShimon. The second lottery came out for Shimon. And Vayihi nachlatam betoch nachalat bnei Yehudah. And their inheritance was an enclave in the inheritance of the descendants of Judah. Shimon does not receive a part of the land on its own. If we recall, in the previous lessons, I mentioned that the description or the drawing of the parts of the tribes are going to receive already is laid out by Jacob in the last few months of his life. Towards the end of the book of Genesis, we are referring to chapter 49. And there, Jacob says, Shimon veLevi achim. Shimon and Levi are brothers. And I'm reading in verse 7. Arur apam ki az, ve'evratam ki kashata, achalkem b'Yaakov ve'afitzem b'Yisrael. They are cursed, Shimon and Levi. I will divide them among the people and disperse them in Israel. Shimon and Levi both did not receive parts in the land on their own. But where Levites, Levi, received the part in Ephraim, every one of the tribes, because he worships, in God is his part, is his inheritance, Shimon loses out. The continuation of the words of Jacob we find in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses, on the last of his days, divides the land to the tribes. And Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 33, says, Ula Levi Amar, and to Levi, you will yoru mishpatecha liYaakov, in verse 10, you will be teaching, and therefore you will be spread around the different tribes. Shimon is not mentioned at all in the words of Moses, but when he mentions Judah, Vezot li Yehudah vayomar, and this is what he says to Judah, Shema Adonai kol Yehudah. Listen to the voice of Yehudah. And in the word Shema is hinted that Shimon. Shema, listen, Shimon. So Shimon does not get it part on his own, he is part in Judah. Now we will refer to this phenomena, in a few of the other tribes also. We see that there are several of the tribes who received different cities. And the names of these cities, we find them appear again and again. For instance, if we refer to the tribe of Zebulun, we see that he has various different tribes, and he has the cities, and his cities are Chanaton, and Yiftachel, and Katat, and etc., etc. But then when it comes to Yisachar and Naphtali, we see there's a city that appears twice. In verse 22, we have Veshachtima Uveit Shemesh, and that's in the tribe of Yisachar. And the same thing happens in the tribe of Naphtali, and I'm referring to verse 38, V'yiron Migdal El Charam Uveit Anat Uveit Shemesh. Beit Shemesh appears here twice. But if we recall in verse 15, Beit Shemesh already appeared. Beit Shemesh, and this is a different Beit Shemesh. In the tribe of Judah, we have mentioned the city of Beit Shemesh. And I'm referring to the border of Judah. And it says in verse 10, the Nasav HaGavul, and his border should go, the Arad Beit Shemesh, and go through Beit Shemesh. So Beit Shemesh here is mentioned a few times. We have several different cities that the same thing happens. For instance, if I mentioned the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Yisachar, we see that amongst the tribe of Naphtali, we have another city that appears once again. We have, in verse 36, V'adama v'harama v'chatzor. Harama and Chatzor are names of cities we've had in the past also. The Ramah, which means a hill, and Chatzor, which means a courtyard, which is usually referred to a courtyard where we have horses, and these are cities that have been appeared before or earlier also. We also have the city, for instance, the city of Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the famous city of Bethlehem, appears not only in Judah, but it also appears in the tribe of Zevulun in verse 16. V'katat v'nahalal v'shimron v'yidala uveit lechem. Now, this phenomena of cities with different names or the same name in different tribes appears several times. It does appear. It's not rare, and especially when it refers to a specific, I would say, something that has to do with topography. If it's Ramah, which means a hill, if it's Mitzpah, which means a view, or whether it's Beit Lechem, which refers to the city of bread, which means it's an area with a lot of things that grow there, of crop, of various different barley and wheat, etc. But also Beit Shemesh, which may refer to a city which has a lot of sun. The word Shemesh in Hebrew means sun. But then here in the tribe of Judah, we see something interesting. The tribe of Naphtali, it mentions, who borders together with Naphtali. So it says in verse 34, on the south of Naphtali, we have Zvulun, Upaga beZvulun minegev. On the west, Upasher Paga miyam. But then it says, Uvi Yehudah Mizrach Shemesh. Judah on the east. But Judah is not on the east of Naphtali. Judah is much south of Naphtali. So what we do see here is that not only a geographical, topographical part of the view is mentioned as the name of a city which repeats itself, but even the name Yehudah, the name of a tribe, the leading tribe, finds itself in Naphtali as a name of an area. Maybe it's the Yair, the son of Menashe. We don't know exactly who this Judah is, but we see that the name Judah is taken here. We see also actually the same phenomena we see in the book of Samuel. We see that there's a place called in the area of Menashe, on the eastern side of the Jordan, we have a city named Yahar Ephraim. And Yahar Ephraim, and I'm talking about in the book of Samuel 2, I'm talking about in chapter 18, verse 6. Vayetze ha'am hasadeh likrat Yisrael, v'tihi ha'milchama b'yar Ephraim. And the battle takes place in the forest of Ephraim. So what is Ephraim doing in Menashe? But we see that the tribes want to recall other tribes, or the main tribes, even though it's not in their tribe. But the story gets more complicated when we talk about Dan. And Dan is the final tribe to receive. And here in Dan we see many cities who have been mentioned before. And I'm reading in verse 40. Lematei b'nei Dan, v'yihi gvul nachlatam tzor'ah ve'eshtaol. All of these cities are mentioned already in Judah, in chapter 15. And we have the same thing with Timnah and Ekron. These are all names of cities which we've met already in Judah. So now, if I want to point out the phenomena I'm talking about, not only do we have the phenomena of the tribe of Shimon, which inherits in Judah, they don't have part of themselves. Not only names of different tribes that find themselves in other tribes, but here we have the story of Dan. The story of Dan is, I would say, a major story throughout the entire book. When Jacob refers to Dan in chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, Jacob says that Dan is, as we listen carefully, I'm talking about verse 17 in chapter 49, Yehi Dan nachash alei derech, shififon alei orach. Dan will be located on the road, but he will be like a snake. And then it says, Hanoshech ikveisus, he bites the heel of the horse, and the rider, vayipol rochvo achor, and the rider falls backwards. What does this mean? Dan has a problem of finding a location. We see again in the book of Judges, in chapter 19, we see that Dan has a problem finding a location. Dan is on the road. Now he's like a snake, and he's fighting a horse. Of course, usually a horse will be stronger than the snake, unless the snake bites the horse's heel, unless the snake uses tricks, as we see in the judge from the tribe of Dan, Shimshon, Samson. He behaves sort of like with various different tactics of attacking surprisingly, whether it's the Philistines or the different nations that were bothering the people of Israel. He behaves as Dan. He will bite, surprise them from the back, and this is his system. But there's another possibility in Dan, and that is when Dan takes its initiative by itself. When Dan does not manage to settle in its area, it says they go up north, and this is described here in short in our chapter. Vayilachamu im leshem. I'm reading verse 47, and they go up. Vayalu b'nei Dan vayilachamu ad leshem. They fight with Leshem. In the book of Judges, this place Leshem has a different name. I'm talking about in the story which is mentioned in chapter 18. The people of the Dan has not found himself a place to settle yet, and they go up and they capture the city. And the city is not named Leshem, but rather it's named Laish. Laish, which means another word for a lion. And we see the continuation of the blessing of the tribe of Dan, which was blessed by Jacob, that they are a snake. In the book of Deuteronomy, in the words of Moses, we see that Dan has a different name. Dan, the snake, the famous snake, in the words of Moses, I'm talking about chapter 33, verse 22, Uledan amar Dan gur aryeh. Dan is not a snake anymore, but Dan becomes, in the words of Moses, he becomes a lion cub. A lion cub in Hebrew has another name, Laish. So Dan, when they try to settle where they're originally supposed to settle, in the lowlands near Judah, they have to behave like a snake. They have to attack and surprise their enemy. But when they take their initiative and they go up and capture a city, they are sitting up north in different Dan. Dan, which was a Laish. Dan, which is like a lion. So, the city of Dan, which we find here in the geography of Israel, we have Dan up north and Dan in the center of the country. Two systems, or two tactics, two strategies in the fighting the enemy. Either as a snake, and there they're having problems to settle. They're always on the way. Or when they sit on the border of the land up north, they are a laish. They are like a lion. So we have Dan, which represents always the northern part of Israel. Throughout the Tanakh, we see very often that the borders of Israel are from Beersheba to Dan. Dan, which represents the northern part, when they take the initiative and they behave as a lion. So it's in the hands of Dan, who is represented always as the last tribe, the tribe that gathers the people. They're always in the rear side of the camp. Dan has the potential of settling. When will it settle? When it captures Laish. When it does not remain as a snake, but it takes upon itself the nature of a lion. Shalom.